I'm Robert Lipsyte. Tonight, we've created an electronic town meeting here in our studios at Channel 13 and in our sister station in San Francisco, KQED Channel 9. We've brought together panels and audiences to explore the issues and questions facing the lesbian and gay community in the 90s. My co-host in San Francisco is Ginger Casey. Ginger?
For the next 4 hours, we'll be hearing ideas and opinions from a cross-section of the lesbian and gay populations. As more and more gay people seek to form families and raise children, we'll be discussing the redefining of the traditional American family. We'll talk about the political and personal act of coming out and the continuing drive toward liberation, acceptance, and political power.
We're expecting the heat and light in our studios to be generated by 3 provocative documentaries we'll be showing you over the next 4 hours. They will deal with the changing concept of family, the lesbian experience in suburbia, and black men confronting homophobia and racism.
It's a shock to recognize that there are gay fathers and gay mothers.
I think that a lot of people that hate the idea of homosexuality, I know they all know one, or 2, or 10. They just have no idea. But we're all too afraid to stand up and say, I'm one.
In this great gay Mecca, I was an invisible man. I had no shadow, no substance, no place, no history, no reflection. I was an alien, unseen and seen, unwanted. Here, as in Hepzibah, I was a nigger, still.
Tomorrow, in both our cities, hundreds of thousands of people will take part in the lesbian and gay pride parades. These parades began in 1970, marking the anniversary of the Stonewall riot, a milestone for the gay community in American society.
In the 21 years since Stonewall, when New York gays and lesbians rioted after being attacked by police, the gay community has fought and won many battles. Before 1980, there were 6 openly gay elected officials. Today, there are 50. There are hundreds of new organizations serving the gay and lesbian community. During the last presidential election, the Human Rights Campaign Fund, with a budget of $3.5 million, was the 8th largest independent political action committee in the country. Yet half the states in the Union still have sodomy laws criminalizing homosexual relations. Gay bashing, as well as other forms of homophobia, is increasing at every level of society, and openly gay artists are the targets of attack on the Senate floor.
I don't even acknowledge that the fellow who did it was an artist. I think he was a jerk.
And of course there's AIDS, the disease which galvanized the gay movement during the 80s. Mainstream gay organizations and grassroots activist groups are largely responsible for the increasing federal appropriations to combat AIDS. AIDS has not only increased the visibility of the lesbian and gay community, it has mobilized the community's political activism. This week's International Scientific AIDS Conference in San Francisco has been upstaged by social and political protests.
More than 100 organizations from around the world chose not to attend the 6th International Conference on AIDS in San Francisco, protesting an immigration and naturalization policy against those infected with the AIDS virus. Assurances from the federal government that it would allow people in to attend the conference have not been enough for those who want the law changed. Activists and demonstrators want any restriction on those with the AIDS virus removed. So while scientists and doctors readied their papers for the conference, media attention was focused on what was going on outside the conference hall.
What do we do? Act up like that!
In San Francisco, this kind of activism is not unique. This is a city considered the model for the rest of the nation for AIDS care and funding. It is a city which has tried to pass a domestic partners law, which has openly gay politicians, and which has recently agreed to set up a novel program for gay teens in the school district. While it was once enough for lesbians and gays to declare their sexuality, that approach is changing. Sobered by the devastating impact of the AIDS epidemic, lesbians and gays have now become part of the system, fighting for their rights with increasing clout, emerging as a political force to be reckoned with.
Before AIDS, the gay movement saw sexuality as liberation. Now, having organized a campaign against the disease, lesbians and gays are using politics as liberation. Joining us to discuss that in New York are Gabriel Rotello, editor-in-chief Outweek, a national gay and lesbian magazine; Dr. Marjorie Hill, director of Mayor Dinkins' Office of Lesbian and Gay Affairs; Ann Northrup, activist with ACT UP and a gay and lesbian educator; Tom Stoddard, executive director, Lambda Legal Defense and Education Fund; and in San Francisco with Ginger.
Bob, we have Jackie Goldsby, editor and writer of Outlook magazine; Cleve Jones, the founder of the AIDS Quilt and a longtime political activist; and Carol Migden, a member of the San Francisco Democratic Party who has worked to promote domestic partners legislation in San Francisco. Welcome, and thank you all for coming by. I imagine we should open our program by discussing what agenda the gay community has as it moves into the 90s. Cleve, perhaps you could start.
Well, I think the most important thing in the 90s is going to be reclaiming the political agenda that predates the AIDS epidemic. During most of the 80s, most of us have had to concentrate all of our energies and resources on the epidemic because of the lack of government response. In the 90s, I think we're going to have to go back to the issues that came before that, family issues, the question of violence, and also in particular dealing with the issues of youth in our own community and the divisions of racism and sexism within our own community.
Jackie.
I would agree with Cleve on the point about racism. It seems to me that as we move into the 90s, that the agenda has to change, and it seems to me that including race is very critical to even expanding the definition of family that we're trying to put forward, and to account for the presence of lesbians and gays of color as an affirmative presence, that we have thoughts, ideas, and a political agenda and a sense about politics to offer as well.
Carol?
I think we have to expand the agenda. We still have a lot of work to do on AIDS. We'll continue to do that. That's increasingly important, and we've made some inroads, but let us not forget that AIDS is also going to dominate in the 90s as well. We have to get back to issues of discrimination and get legislative protections on the job site, in the workplace. Our relationships have to be validated. We got to pass domestic partnership. We have people in our audience with bright T-shirts that are enthusiastic. I think it's important that we get back on track with things that are positive, that are life-affirming, and also be mindful that we have a lot of, still a burden ahead with regard to AIDS.
Let's check with New York and see if the agenda there will be any different. Bob?
Thank you, Ginger. Dr. Marjorie Hill, let's start with you. You're in City Hall in New York. What is your thoughts about the agenda for the 90s?
Well, one of the primary concerns for this administration and for many lesbians and gays in the city is the issue of increasing violence against lesbians and gays. Many of us know that nationwide violence against our community has risen 122%, and that's just not acceptable. The second issue is that our community has a real task to make sure that our representation is diverse and inclusive of people of color, of women, and also of individuals with disabilities. So I think that dealing with the issues around violence, domestic partnership, as well as making sure that our representatives are truly as inclusive as possible of the issues that the Dinkins administration and many of the activists in New York are concerned about.
Thank you. Gabriel Rotello?
I agree with what everyone has said so far. One thing I would add would be trying to create a sort of spiritual climate within the gay movement that encourages people to come out of the closet. I don't think that we're going to see a lot more progress than we've seen in the last 20 years unless a lot more gay and lesbian people come out of the closet. In order to do that, a lot of the social agenda has to be moved forward. But within the gay and lesbian community itself, we have to sort of create spiritual models for gay and lesbian people that encourage people that are in the closet to come out, and I think that we're beginning to see us doing that right now.
Tom Stoddard?
Gabriel's just made a very important point. Change has to be along two tracks. One is the law, where we work toward absolute equality for lesbians and gay men as well as for all Americans. But the most important aspect really is hearts and minds of Americans, reaching them and making them understand that lesbians and gay men are people entitled to full and fair treatment on a social level as well as a legal level. And coming out is really the only way to ultimately accomplish that, by making gay people visible to the rest of the world.
Ann Northrup?
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't argue with anything that's been said so far. I agree with all of it. I think we have a long way to go just fundamentally in getting ourselves accepted as human beings in the first place. And I think the violence that's visited upon us, as Dr. Hill mentioned, is completely out of control. And I think that the heterosexual community has to put us on their agenda too. And I think that it is wrong to think that we are a monolithic community. We are many communities. We have many agendas and many priorities that are different among us. And I just want everyone to know that there is not one agenda, there are many.
Do you feel, Ann, that you said this is a problem for the heterosexual community?
You bet it is.
What must the heterosexual community do?
The heterosexual community must stop assuming that everyone in this world is heterosexual, and must stop assuming that there is something wrong with homosexuality, and must... And the heterosexual community, if it is to survive itself, must stop killing those who are different from it. The heterosexual community, for its own peace of mind and survival as a species, must include everybody of every sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, age, ability, whatever, across the board.
Marjorie, of everybody at this table, you are closest to the precincts of power, towards the power of the heterosexual community. Do you see gay people having the clout to make those force those kind of changes?
I think that lesbians and gays, particularly in New York City, are increasingly visible in city government. My appointment is one example of that. There are a number of leading gays and lesbians in the Dinkins administration. I also think that in terms of our collective voices, that the administration and the city politicians who court the gay and lesbian community are very much aware, so that I think that we are approaching a point where we are becoming more visible. That's not to say that we can all relax, that there's a lot of work to be done. And on the note about the heterosexual community, one of the things that really needs to happen is that the education has to begin with our children, that our children have to learn about different types of cultures, different types of lifestyles, and that has to happen in kindergarten, second grade, elementary school, that people form their opinions and values very early on, and the Board of Education has a real responsibility in that regard.
Thank you. People in San Francisco seem to be closer to the precincts of power. Ginger, let's go back to you.
San Francisco is, of course, considered perhaps one of the most tolerant cities in the world in terms of the gay community, but even in our area, is homophobia still the biggest obstacle to be overcome?
Absolutely. I mean, even in San Francisco today, after 2 decades of a very visible lesbian and gay community, we still have a terrible problem with violence in the streets. Just recently, we've had a number of pretty ugly examples of it. And also the kind of homophobia that is inadvertently expressed by some of the politicians in our town during the controversy with the school board, for example, over Project 10. It's still very much an issue.
Why don't you explain that briefly for our New York audience?
We have a proposal here in San Francisco to create a program for young lesbians and gay men in the school system modeled after Project 10 in Los Angeles that is basically a counseling and referral center. And it brought out a lot of the homophobes out of the woodwork. But I was really struck by their arguments against it. It's so clear that they just don't understand what we're about. And what I try and hold on to is a sense that these are not necessarily my enemies, that these are potential allies that have yet to understand the common sense of what we're saying.
Right.
Very well put there.
Thank you.
Carol?
I mean, I think we were all struck by that when we were lobbying for the Project 10, which again is an in-service program for kids that are lesbian or gay. And we feel we're a gay city. It should have just been handily supported and easily affirmed, and yet there were great pockets of problems and neighbors and citizens that came out to protest against it, which was deeply distressing. One has to remember that we will continue to be an unpopular minority. We're different, and what we're trying to do is stand up and affirm ourselves and take our right and seize power and be understood and demand a place at the table. But that shouldn't necessarily be predicated upon a change of attitude per se alone, and think that deep-seated resistance to gayness is going to change immediately. I mean, that's an attitudinal thing that takes generations. We have to continue to work and struggle and prove that we're part of the community, that we have a positive contribution to make, but realize that we're going to continue to meet with great resistance.
Jackie, do the positive things that the community has achieved, do they become overshadowed by the Helmses of the world?
They do. I mean, in so much that the voice of Helms, he has access to power, he has access to CNN to put his line out there, but I think it raises the issue for discussion and becomes a part of discourse, which is really critical, so that it's on the lips of everyone in America, if we can speak rhetorically for a minute. I think what concerns me about the issue of the NEA is that when it focused specifically on Mapplethorpe's pictures, that the whole issue of race got subverted or suppressed in that discussion, and that it's very critical as we talk about connecting with the heterosexual community, coming out, that there's a way in which we allow for people of color to come out as well, and so that the issues of sexuality and identity and race get articulated on the table too. Because when I think of the whole concept of outing, for example, I have my issues with it, but on the other hand, I want to have black people come out, black lesbians and gays to come out, because so often homosexuality is seen as a white thing. And it becomes very critical for those of us who are out to stand up and say, I have chosen this because of who I am, and it is a part of my blackness, it is a part of my culture, how I express it.
But that was your choice. The whole concept of outing, some people argue, is taking away someone's choice on declaring their sexuality.
Right, I have my problems with it. And on some level, I think that outing enforces the same lack of choice that the general social conditions that make us stay in the closet. It's structurally similar to me. So that I have my objections to outing as a political strategy to deal with the issue of political visibility or invisibility.
We'll talk some more about this a little later on. Let's check back with New York now. Bob?
Well, the issue of outing has been brought up, and that naturally brings us to Gabriel Rotello in Outweek magazine.
Yes.
It's a natural link. You've talked about the need for gays to step forward, to be role models, and everybody seems to be agreed that that's necessary, and yet the controversy exists about forcing people.
Yeah, there's also a need, I think, for the practice of journalism to stop suppressing the idea that there are powerful gays and lesbians throughout society. It's something that journalism has been doing for a long, long time. And outing, to me anyway, I mean, a lot of people have different ideas of what it's about. To me, it simply refers to an ending of the practice of suppressing the truth about the number of gay people and lesbians that permeate our society.
Well, let's try to make the link. Tom, maybe you can help us make the link between people coming out and the advancement of the political process in which there are rights for gay people.
Well, the truth is that only a tiny fraction of gay people are out in any real sense. And because of that, most Americans, I think, who are not lesbian or gay, still think they don't know any gay people. And so I would make a personal appeal to every lesbian and gay man to make a step forward over this weekend in particular, and to understand that political progress is tied to personal advancement, that the personal is the political. Gabriel, by the way, is absolutely right that there's a journalistic double standard on this, and I don't disagree with him about that at all. All of the newspapers and television stations talk regularly about the social lives of heterosexual stars, but don't talk about gay stars at all. It's a double standard, it's unacceptable, and it has to be changed.
And do you think that gay political progress is linked to people coming forward?
Oh, undoubtedly, it's the bottom line. And I want to suggest that if people are not comfortable coming out in their personal lives, at work, whatever, that the one step they can take to come out, the one that's crucially important at this point, is that they come out to their political representatives, that they write their senators and congressmen and state representatives and local, because George Bush declared war on us this week by being at Jesse Helms' fundraiser Wednesday on the opening day of the AIDS conference. And we can no longer afford to be invisible to our representatives. George Bush is either blackmailed into going to Jesse Helms' fundraiser or fully supports that, and either way, he declared war on us this week, and we must stop hiding. We have to stand up for our rights because we cannot count on the President of the United States to support us as human beings.
Marjorie Hill, do you think that politicians will respond to that?
I think so, that politicians are bright individuals, and that, for the most part, and that they really,
have more faith than I do.
and that they will respond to a visible constituency.
Well, they want to be reelected.
Absolutely, and that there is power in numbers. I think that around Tom's appeal that individuals come out, I also think that our community has a responsibility to embrace and welcome individuals where they are, and that our communities, our community centers, our organizations, our lesbian and gay institutions should encourage those who have not traditionally supported or attended those events to come and to attend them. That our community is not always safe for all of the lesbians and gays that are there.
We've been led to believe in New York that San Francisco is more sophisticated in just these kind of processes. Ginger, I wonder if anybody in your panel would like to address that.
Well, of course, they always say that in Oakland people go to work and in San Francisco they go to breakfast, so I suppose in that sense. But Carol, you have some strong feelings about outing.
Yeah, I suppose. I think everybody does, and clearly it's an issue that's percolating. I think it's appropriate sometimes when it's an act of self-defense.
Give us an example.
Well, it is a time of war. I mean, that was articulately just stated by the ACT UP representative in New York, that clearly it is a time of war, and war has been declared upon us, and it has been for a decade, and boys are dying, and there's really no relief in sight. So if there are individuals in position of power and authority who do harm to us, then it is a matter, it's an appropriate measure to out them if that will somehow help or eradicate it or stamp it out and end it.
Well, who determines what the harm is? Does that
Well, there's
become a
some
very
individuals, whether it's J.
subjective
Edgar Hoover or a congressperson or people that are in power, just as what's stated, political people, of course, are critical. They have to be impacted. They have to be made to understand that there'll be consequences to actions. And if they're personal choices that one chooses to live, to live a closet life hurts the gay movement politically and psychologically. I'm not saying that means you cavalierly toss people out of the closet, but if people are doing harm to us, then I think it is an appropriate action.
You know, you think of a scenario in which, say, somebody in Congress is gay and they're keeping it very quiet. There's a bill coming up that is dealing with gay issues, but it is attached, say, to a highway bill that they're not in favor of. Will they be threatened to be outed if they do not vote the party line in a situation like this? Will they be seen as enemies?
I mean, then they should take the rider off the bill and work to do that. I mean, there are measures that can be done. The issue would be that if somebody is gay and is voting in a way that contradicts the best interests of the community and we can amass some political power by exposing that, then that's just an option that has to be considered. You just can't back away from it and say it's never appropriate in any circumstance because it is a time of war which dictates unusual ground rules.
Cleve, but is it something that could be exploited?
Well, it's been exploited for a very long time by heterosexuals. You know, I came out when I was a teenager, and I've always been really impatient with people that stayed in the closet. I think it's really stupid. It's a waste of their lives. But I think that even in 1990, we have to recognize that risks remain. I know a great many lesbian women who lost their children when they were either exposed or chose to come out of the closet. I know of men and women who have lost their jobs. I myself have experienced violence on the street because of being out there. So I think we have to acknowledge that the risks are real, that they still exist, and I don't feel that anyone has the right to rip anyone out of the closet unless clearly they are hiding and exploiting homophobia to advance their career. I worked in the California legislature for many years. I know of homosexuals in the California legislature, and I'm not going to say their names because they would not be reelected and they vote right. And so that is, to me, the litmus test. If one of those people turns around and begins to exploit homophobia and to hurt our people, then I would have no qualms whatsoever about ripping them out of the closet and exposing them as a hypocrite.
Let's go back to New York and check with Bob.
To our panelists in San Francisco and in New York, thanks so very much. An increasing number of gay and lesbian families are refocusing the gay movement to include the fight for legislation that will protect alternative families. In the process, they are redefining the traditional family structure. Now, that's the subject of our first documentary, We Are Family. After the film, we'll be back with different panelists to talk about marriage and the agenda of family rights for lesbians and gays.
Presentation of this program is made possible in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, David P. Becker, and the Edward W. Hazen Foundation.